Ina mana, ina iwi, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Rod Carr, aho. Thank you for the privilege of being able to talk to you this afternoon. I thought there were three ways I could spend my time with you. One, which I rejected, was to walk you through the advice that the Climate Change Commission has provided to governments of the day for the last 5 years. Thousands of pages, hundreds of recommendations, lots of taxpayer money. It's all on the web. You can read it all. If you haven't read it by now, you probably won't. Okay, so we won't do that. Secondly, I thought I could do some climate science with you and spread enough doom and gloom so that you'd all want to have a quick drink after and then go home. The climate science is pretty much done. The climate science was pretty much done some time ago. The climate science is pretty compelling, and actually the world has taken it on board. So I don't think I'm going to spend any time today talking to you about melting glaciers, greenhouse gases, ocean acidification, all of that stuff. If there are any deniers in the room, I'd be happy to meet you outside afterwards. Then I thought I could do a bit of a rigmarole about, well, why we have to wait for someone else, why, Beijing or Washington or London or somewhere else is responsible, and they should really do something, and we shouldn't do much until they do something. And then I thought, no, what I would do with my time with you today was focus on the reason why, after 5 years of doing this, and I've got to say, compared to running a university, this was hard. Compared to dealing with earthquakes, this was hard. Compared to doing a turnaround of a failing software company, this was tough. So I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist for New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand. I'm an optimist because I don't think we have to wait for anybody. I'm an optimist because I think it is now in our own self-interest to take positive action to deal with the changing climate. And dealing with the changing climate is not just about retreat or protection. Dealing with the changing climate is to understand the products and services that the world is going to want, particularly the affluent world is going to want by the middle of this century. And to understand that New Zealand has within its grasp an extraordinary opportunity in its own self-interest to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, and in its own self-interest to prepare for the changing climate. New Zealand's particular circumstances around climate mitigation, that is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from how we live our lives and how we make our living, is pretty simple. We have to decarbonise the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air. I'll come back to that. Secondly, we need to use efficiently, with as little waste as possible, the energy that we produce and use, and all resources that we need to sustain our way of living. And thirdly, how we use the land will be critical to the health and prosperity of this generation, not just generations to come. Remember, 70% of the people alive in New Zealand today will be alive in 2050. It's about us. It's about now. So let's look at the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air. The technology that was developed in the 19th century that enabled us to liberate the stored energy in fossil fuels was truly extraordinary. It underpinned our civilization, growth and prosperity. The combustion of fossil fuels in the open air is not only used to make electricity, but it is also used to move us and stuff around. If we are to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we either need to capture those gases at the point of combustion and permanently, chemically store them in the geosphere, or we have to swap out the technology where we cannot realistically do carbon capture at the point of combustion. What are the points of combustion in New Zealand today? Well, over 4 million motor vehicles for a start. Do we have known technology to materially reduce those points of combustion? Yeah. We don't have to invent anything new to dramatically reduce the combustion of fossil fuels in light vehicle fleet in New Zealand, which is 70% of our transport emissions. And we are that close to being able to do the same for heavy freight on road. Again, others are working on the technology. We don't have to invent it. We just have to figure out how to adapt it to a New Zealand context. Combustion of fossil fuels and the production of electricity occurs in countably few places in New Zealand. Huntly. The combustion of fossil fuels to make electricity accounts for 80% of greenhouse gas emissions globally today, largely burning coal and some fossil gas. New Zealand has the means to get off coal. The world has known reserves of 150 years of coal at the current rate of consumption. We don't need to look for, let alone find, any more coal. The planet cannot absorb all of the coal that we could burn that we know about unless you were to do effective carbon capture and storage at the point of combustion. At which point there are still issues with mining coal, but that's no longer about greenhouse gas emissions. The combustion of fossil fuels for the production of medium and low temperature process heat is now no longer economically viable for new plant and equipment. The existing plant and equipment can either be left to reach the end of its technical life, repurposed to use other fuel sources with capture at the point of combustion, or retired early. No new technology is needed. For New Zealand, the energy equation is about renewables and energy storage. The opportunities in New Zealand are truly extraordinary. Solar. Photovoltaic cells are a game changer. Last year, the world had manufacturing capacity to produce 1 terawatt, not 1 terawatt hour, but 1 terawatt of solar cell generation capacity. We only deployed 560 gigawatts. The global manufacturing capacity is nearly twice the current deployment rate for photovoltaic cells. Photovoltaic cells are modular, inherently democratic and distributed, operating at maximum critical scale at small, relatively small, amounts of capital investment. In New Zealand, because of the way we regulate the electricity market, photovoltaic cells for own use of electricity behind the meter cuts out the lines company, Transpower, GST on the lines company and Transpower charges, and leaves the user with electricity at less than 10 cents a kilowatt hour. The economics of behind the meter generation are here today. We don't have to invent anything. Wind is more expensive, but slightly more reliable, but slightly less predictable than solar. New Zealand has some of the best quality on and offshore wind resource in the world. The newest offshore wind turbines can generate electricity with wind run of less than 8 kilometres an hour. We didn't have to invent it. We just have to choose to use it. Almost uniquely, we have geothermal capability, which last month was responsible on some days for generating nearly 20% of all the electricity produced in New Zealand. It's a resource that needs to be managed carefully, but it is a resource available for New Zealand. Run-of-the-river hydro, and given we have virtually no deep hydro lakes to speak of, has played its part, but has often been more environmentally challenging to square the circle. But it does strike some of us as extraordinary that on the west coast of New Zealand they pay some of the highest electricity prices while burning coal to warm glass houses, while the rain rains and the rivers run to the sea. There needs to be a sensible and sustainable way to harvest some of that energy for the use on the west coast. We don't need nuclear power. The Australians are probably on that pathway, and there may be some types of heavy industry that are best located proximate to a nuclear power plant. We don't need them. We can buy that stuff. So the energy story for New Zealand is extraordinary, an extraordinary story of opportunity. You don't need a lot of land under solar to meet most of the increase in demand for electricity likely before 2050 in New Zealand. 400 hectares of solar has the capacity to generate the equivalent of one Rankine engine at Huntly each year. One is coal-fired, imported coal. The other is ours. In transport, the vulnerability of long, complex supply chains and the mega economies of scale required in the production, refining and movement of liquid fossil fuels has always exposed New Zealand to a national security risk. And previously, there was no known alternative effective technology for much of the work that liquid fossil fuel, oil, did in our society. That is no longer true. If China is prepared to manufacture high-quality battery electric cars with massive public subsidies, why would we not take advantage of them? We don't have a motor vehicle assembly industry to protect. We don't have an industrial base to build. Transport is a no-brainer. The Climate Change Commission's estimate is that by 2035, that's not that long from now, if decarbonisation of ground transportation hit the demonstration path, annual healthcare costs for lung disease would be $2.7 billion lower than it will be if we stay on the current trajectory. That's our lungs, our parents' lungs, our kids' lungs. It has nothing to do with Beijing or Washington. Why would we not take up low emissions transport technology, particularly in built-up urban areas? How we have allowed the bicycle to be weaponised in a political debate is completely on us. We let that happen. We let the backyard barbecue be weaponised in the gas industry ridicule. How did we ever let that happen? The choices around energy production and use are for us to make, with consequences for our lives and opportunities for our employment, for reducing our vulnerability to overseas foreign suppliers and disruption. One of the fascinating things about the oil industry is that even if the price of oil at the wellhead went to $0, all of the other costs would mean you are still paying 2/3 of the price you currently pay for petrol at the pump. That if you do some simple arithmetic, what you learn is that in the average New Zealand car, if you pay $2.50 a litre for petrol, you're paying 25 cents a kilometre to move around. If you get hydrogen for $15 a kilogram, you're paying 15 cents energy cost to move around. And if you get electricity at 20 cents a kilowatt hour, you're paying 5 cents per kilometre for the energy to get around. So the economics in energy and transport are already past a tipping point. Very quickly, because we want to get to the panel and have lots of questions, land use. New Zealand burnt to the ground 10 million hectares of indigenous forest and created our pasture land and a pastoral-based economy. Some arable farming, but largely dominated by ruminant livestock farming. We got very good at it, and we believed some of the stories we like to tell ourselves about it. The truth is that we have got to figure out, first by taking ownership, and then by doing something about it, how to deal with biogenic methane emitted from ruminant livestock. It's a fact. It's also a fact that the way the atmosphere sees that molecule of methane is not distinguishable from how it sees a molecule of methane from a gas field. The chemistry is the same. When the farmers assert they don't get credit for the grass they grow, that is not actually true. The simple reason is that fossil methane has a warming potential attributed to it of 32 times a tonne of carbon dioxide in a 100-year period. Biogenic methane, a multiple of 28. The difference is the short carbon cycle of the grass. It's already accounted for. Secondly, while we talk about global warming potential over 100 years, the world is going to soon panic about global warming potential for much shorter periods. Because in much shorter periods than we expected, we will pass tipping points and irreversibility. At that point, it is game on in the war against methane. Because in a 20-year period, 1 tonne of methane has the warming effect of 86 tonnes of carbon dioxide. It's like turning on a very, very powerful heater, even if only for a short time, in a well-insulated room. So don't get fooled by the arguments about the life of the gas. It's irrelevant. It's the warming potential it has when it's there, or would reduce if it wasn't. I think you are going to see massive new technologies in alternative protein production, massive changes in consumer preference away from high-emitting forms of protein production, and foreign regulators beginning to look closely at those countries that do not appear to be taking seriously or making serious progress in dealing with this source of greenhouse gases. The much vaunted emissions trading scheme is not what it is asserted to be. It is not a cap and trade system. The reason it doesn't have a cap is because you can introduce an unlimited amount of forestry into it. The reason it is uncapped in any period that matters for achieving emissions budgets is that the overhang of already issued pollution rights is huge relative to our annual change in emissions. New Zealand's total gross annual emissions, 75 million tonnes a year. Our sequestration in forests, roughly 10 million tonnes a year. The estimated overhang in the emissions trading scheme, that is the likely to be available for sale, more than 80 million tonnes. It is not a capped system. It cannot set a price that is meaningfully trading off 1 tonne of new carbon dioxide emissions with 1 tonne of impermanent sequestration in pine forests. We can say what we like, we can believe what we like, it won't change what is true. Changing land use will create lands that simply are abandoned. Abandoned lands do not revert to indigenous native forests. We will need to take responsibility for the protection of abandoned lands, or they themselves will become the source of the next generation's wildfires and pests. So the challenge for New Zealand is not a lack of opportunity, not a lack of technology. The challenge for New Zealand is getting us all on the page that says by 2050, this country could be healthier, wealthier, less vulnerable, more prosperous than it will be on its current trajectory. The Climate Change Commission has been strong in recommending to government in its policy development it needs not to consult with Māori, not merely to engage with Māori, but government needs to partner with Māori. Why? Because it turns out Māori possess, control and influence land use in New Zealand like no other collective consciousness. Mobilising that consciousness is a necessary condition for us to seize that opportunity. Kia ora.
Has anyone got any questions for Rod?
Yeah, Rod, if you're a large-scale holder of carbon credits, what would you do now? Sell them?
So when I was at the Reserve Bank, friends and family used to ask what would I do with my interest rate, and I said, I'm never going to give you advice about that. It depends entirely why you are holding carbon credits. So there's more than 160 million in the bank, and the Climate Change Commission guesstimates about how many of those are held partly by iwi and Māori corporations and other entities that believe they're as good as the land that the trees stand on. They're not for sale, they're never for sale. The land is inalienable. They happen to end up with these units. They don't see them as cash, therefore they're not for sale. Then there's another group held by forestry interests that is a natural hedge to their obligation if they ever find it uneconomic to restock land with pine trees. So they need to hold those units on the grounds that they're in the business of plantation, rotation, harvesting. So hold the units, don't necessarily sell them until you're ready to stop that business. Then you've got another group that are basically holding short-term positions because, well, they can and they want to, and maybe the price will go up, maybe it'll go down. You've got some of the high emitters that figure they could buy them and inventory them at a lower cost than the risk of buying them later. So I think, you've got a whole bunch of reasons for holding carbon units that isn't just related to a short-term price expectation. But the Climate Change Commission's work, so this is not a personal opinion, the Climate Change Commission says if you leave the system the way it is today, by 2035, those with obligations in the system to buy units will not need all the units that are becoming available as a result of already and forecast forest planting. And the price will go down dramatically. So that is a forecast given current policy settings.
Kia ora, Rod. Thank you for that. Similar question. If you're a large owner of beef and sheep farm land, and some of that land is at risk of being abandoned, presumably that some of that land could have renewable energy production opportunities.
Yep.
What would you do if you were a big owner of beef and sheep farms?
Yeah, again, depends entirely on actually land type, land class, and all the rest of it. I think we are moving away from as much mono management of land to management of land that is more sympathetic with the land itself. So in any large block of land, there is likely to be some diversity, and in that diversity lies the opportunity. Some of it may be best managed abandonment. And why I say managed abandonment is for fear if you just lock it and leave it, it will come back to haunt you. Some of it, quite frankly, could go under solar, either for on-farm use or for other emerging activities that require electricity as our newest form of bulk energy. Some of it may be good for biomass for energy. And that doesn't necessarily mean rapeseed crops, maybe shorter rotation types of biomass for energy. So it will depend on the situation and circumstances. And like any business, we learn so much by doing. There's only so much you can do by studying and theorising and paying consultants. So maybe learn by doing is New Zealand's best effort at figuring out what the new use of land will be. Big proponent of learn by doing.
My understanding is, at this point in time, globally, I think this is what you were saying, reflecting the experience in Aotearoa. Essentially, the transportation emissions problem is solved with technology, it just needs to be deployed. The generation part of the picture is also largely solved, it just needs to change. Mm-hmm. The bit that's completely unsolved is the agricultural sector, which is roughly a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, biggest source of loss of biodiversity, etc. So my question is, how much time do you think we have as a country to actually...
I think we're out of time. Just, when was the best time to act? Yesterday. When was a better time? A week ago. So let's be very careful about this sort of... the production of protein with much lower emissions than our particularly red meat protein is a solved problem. Right? So just for those of you who are not kind of aware, for every kilogram of sheep and beef meat that we produce, before you get into fiddling about, dairy, beef and the wool attributed to the protein in the sheep, is roughly 20 kilograms of greenhouse gases per kilo of meat protein produced. 20 to 1. Pork and chicken, 5 to 1. Now, nobody's saying that they are direct substitutes, but the next issue is we sell a lot of our red meat protein to people who are eating 3 to 5 times the average daily protein required for human living. So we are not servicing the hungry few. And the argument that if we didn't do it, then someone else would do it worse is also not true. So now that we've got emerging data on emissions at herd level for dairy farms across New Zealand, what we observe in the data is that some of our lowest emitting dairy herds are at 8 kilograms of greenhouse gases per kilo of milk solids, and others are at 18. So the between herd differences in New Zealand are way bigger than the difference in averages between dairying countries. And you could shed some of New Zealand's high emitting herds and replace them with the average emissions of a herd, and the planet would be better off in greenhouse gases and no worse off in milk protein production.
Thank you, Rod. That was very informative. Not sure I understand it all, but I'm interested in your last comment with regard to Māori landowners. I think it's Māori landowners' influence in the future, and wondering whether you could explain that further, please.
Yeah. So I think it's pretty clear that there is a difference in the way a Maori cultural perspective makes decisions about land use, family, community than the transactional, short-term, selfish and reckless way that our refined market economy promotes. That the refined market economy would actually have made Adam Smith roll in his grave. Adam Smith, who was the father of modern economics, responsible for the phrase the invisible hand, used to teach economics before economics was a thing. He made his students read his first work, called The Theory of Moral Sentiment, before allowing them to read and be taught The Wealth of Nations. And the theory of moral sentiment was founded when Adam Smith was writing at the end of the 18th century, so go, 1760, 1770, on a fundamental belief that humans were empathetic, that humans cared about each other and their circumstances, and that given that worldview, then if you went about your daily business to the maximum of your own self-interest, society would be well off. But it stood on that foundation of assumption of empathy. Somewhere in the latter part of the 20th century, we kind of lost the plot on that. I don't think Indigenous cultures went on the same journey. I think the consequence is that not just in Māori, but in other Indigenous communities, there is more recognition of the importance of time and community. So I think that's where we can use other insights in how human society is organised to realise the opportunity. And it does turn out in New Zealand that Māori have more influence and control over land and land use than we might have recognised, even if it is a fraction of what it once was.
I'm going to ask a question then following on that from that, if anyone's got one, which is following on from that point about the level of influence that we have as Māori investment entities particularly, and the control over land. We've probably got a lot of entities in this room who do have control over significant land, but also have a significant amount of investment in spaces that don't change the dial on land use. What's the number one thing that you would like all of the people in this room to take away, and the number one question you'd be encouraging us to ask ourselves when we're making investment decisions?
Well, I think the first one is about time and urgency. The transition is underway. Whether you voted for it or not, whether you like it or not, the transition to a low emissions energy economy is underway. It's going to be lumpy, there's going to be setbacks, but it's not just driven by a concern for the environment and ecology. Now it is actually going to be driven by vulnerable supplies, supply shocks, as well as the economics of the new technologies, the clean technologies that have emerged. So, you really do take a risk if you keep looking backwards as you walk into the future, that you will just walk off the cliff, right? So time, I think, is the thing. And time fronts up in a number of ways. First of all, Western civilization has fragmented and granularised time to such an extent that the finance industry has put a value on time. And the finance industry values time by halving the future every 10 years, 7% discount rate. How can it possibly be true that my grandchildren are worth half of what I'm worth? It doesn't make sense. So while finance theory works at the firm level, it does not work as decision criteria. We are concerned about community, sovereignty, and the future. In the same way, the whole least cost-benefit analysis, first of all, begs the question, cost to who? Benefit for who? Because it was designed as an accounting mechanism to allocate scarce resources within a firm, where the cost was to the firm and the benefit was to the firm. Cost-benefit analysis was never designed to make trade-offs over generations and between communities. So some of these mutated forms of finance theory have found their way into public policy formulation, which can explain some of the absurd decisions that we see sometimes. So, in answer to your sensible question, think about time not as decaying. Time doesn't decay like some atomic particle. The decisions you make today compound into the future. The benefits compound, but also the costs of delay compound. So think time in all you do. And if you were to take one message away, it would be the time for action is now. We have used all of the opportunity for delay. That if you are not part of the solution, you are the problem.
Kia ora. Thank you for that. You're selling, I think everyone in the room is buying. Absolutely, I think we all agree. And if I'm just to paraphrase what you're saying up there is that we need, our ability to produce renewable energy as an alternative to fossil fuels is unconstrained. Technology's there, we just need to build it, which I'll get to in a second. And then on your second point is that, with the sort of warming of the earth, the war on the production of methane is going to mean that alternative land use is going to be a necessary requirement. So we're buying all that. How do we participate, I guess, from an investment perspective? What are the products, what are the solutions that we can use to be able to help be part of the solution?
Yeah. So in the energy sector, they're really, really clear now that the technology is pretty much done. The constraints are access to the kit and the skills, people with boots on their feet and gloves on their hands to roll this stuff out. So roughly $30 billion needs to be invested in the energy transition in New Zealand over the next 15 years or so. That's an opportunity for capital, but as we heard earlier this morning, capital is the easy bit. Finding the business case and the skills and capability to execute is the challenge. But everything electric is going to be in short supply. The wind turbines, the solar panels, and the short supply is not so much manufacturing capacity, it's the ability to get it installed. It takes about a year now, once you hold your consent to build a solar farm, to have electrons flowing out of it. About 5 years for a wind farm, and never ever for a deep dam. So you can begin to kind of factor some of that into what is the opportunity at modular scale appropriate. We also heard about how do you combine capital where there'll be some risk takers who are prepared to be more exposed than others. The investment banking community loves this stuff, right? It's tiered financing, it's got debt, it's got mezz debt, it's got capital structures. And again, we don't have to create them, we just have to be bold enough to apply them in New Zealand. Not every dollar has to take the same risk. Not everything needs to be a bank loan, not everything needs to be 100% equity. But at $1 million a hectare to roll out solar, that's within the grasp of an awful lot. And behind the meter solar is different from grid scale solar. And not everything grid scale solar is going to actually turn out to deliver the money that people think. But behind the meter solar for own use, looks like such a no-brainer. It staggers me that there aren't more of those initiatives being taken. It takes a load off the lines companies, takes a load off Transpower, halves the price of electricity to the user. It's a payback period of 8 years. So how stupid have you got to be not to do this?
I guess there's a sharing of risk, right? There's sharing of risk between, if it's benefiting society, the role of business, the role of government, and then I guess the role of end consumers to share that risk. Where is government sitting in leadership?
I wouldn't wait for Wellington. Waiting for Wellington is another excuse for delay. There's enough of these opportunities that you don't need to wait for Wellington.
but then I guess you're asking the investors to take that level of risk on to be able to deliver.
Depends
that.
where in the stack they sit.
Kapai.
You're right, but regulatory risk is pretty real in New Zealand. We can flip regulations on toss of a coin. That's why I would be interested in how the ETS plays out. It will not be the same ETS in 5 years' time as it is today.
Yeah.
So there's the regulatory risk in the carbon market, is the unsustainable will not be sustained. So, I think you're right to challenge, who's bearing the risk. Always, if you can sell to government, buy from government, or stick up government with the risk, business looks easier. It's what I call private profit at public expense. And the private sector's been great at it for 250 years. It's not going to stop anytime soon. But actually, some of this just makes sense on its own merits.